Before the first arrow was loosed, before the first sword struck ice, an empire moved quietly into a valley it believed was already won. The Ottoman army advanced with confidence shaped by decades of conquest. Their banners cut through the winter air, their footsteps echoing with the weight of inevitability. This was how empires worked. They arrived, they overwhelmed, and history adjusted itself accordingly. Ahead of them lay Moldavia, smaller, poorer, outnumbered. On paper, the outcome seemed settled long before the march began. And then the valley fell silent. No cheering crowds, no defiant armies rushing forward. Only fog, thick, cold, and unmoving, clinging to frozen rivers and bare trees. The kind of silence that feels less like peace and more like restraint. Somewhere within it waited an army barely half the size of the force entering the valley. 20,000 men facing 80,000. Farmers, woodsmen, veterans hardened by winters rather than glory. What the Ottomans could not see was intention. This was not a story of heroic charges or desperate last stands. It was a story of patience, of leaders who understood that survival sometimes demands resisting instinct, that the land itself, when understood deeply enough, can become a weapon more powerful than numbers. As the fog closed and sound began to deceive, one truth slowly emerged. This valley was not an invitation. It was a test. By the winter of 1475, Eastern Europe stood in the long shadow of an empire that no longer needed introductions. The Ottomans had spent the better part of a century proving a simple truth. Resistance was temporary. Kingdoms argued, alliances hesitated, borders shifted. And then the Ottoman army arrived, methodical and relentless. Constantinople had fallen. The Balkans had bent. One by one, political calculations across the region adjusted to a new reality. The question was no longer whether the Ottomans would advance, but how far, and who would be standing when they did. From Istanbul, Moldavia looked insignificant, a narrow principality wedged between larger powers, lacking great cities, lacking wealth on the scale of Hungary or Poland, and lacking political leverage that usually bought time. Yet Moldavia mattered precisely because of where it stood. It sat astride routes that connected the Black Sea to Central Europe, controlling access through forests, rivers, and mountain passes that armies could not simply bypass. For the Ottomans, leaving Moldavia unconquered was not merely untidy. It was dangerous. An unsecured flank invited interference. A free Moldavia meant a corridor for rivals, and a symbol that the empire's momentum could be questioned. That symbol mattered more than most people realized at the time. To the north, Poland and Lithuania watched carefully but cautiously. To the west, Hungary was fractured by internal struggles. To the south, Wallachia had already been pulled into the Ottoman orbit. Moldavia stood alone, not because it wanted to, but because alliances are built on convenience, not morality. Supporting Moldavia meant provoking a war most of its neighbors were not prepared to fight. Diplomacy produced polite words, delayed promises, and strategic silence. When the Ottomans decided to act, no coalition formed. No relief army marched. There would be no cavalry appearing over the horizon to save the day. At the center of this narrowing circle stood Stephen III of Moldavia, remembered by history as Stephen the Great, though he did not yet know that title would survive him. Stephen was not a romantic ruler in the modern sense. He did not mistake speeches for strength, nor did he believe that honor alone could hold a border. His reign had been shaped by constant pressure, internal revolts, rival claimants, shifting loyalties among nobles who measured allegiance by survival rather than principle. He had learned early that leadership was less about ideals and more about trade-offs. Stephen understood the Ottomans better than many of his contemporaries. He had fought them before, negotiated with them, paid tribute when it bought time, and resisted when delay no longer served him. To outsiders, this looked inconsistent. To Stephen, it was realism. Diplomacy was not a virtue, it was a tool. And by 1474, that tool had worn thin. The Ottomans demanded more than submission. They demanded control, increased tribute, political compliance, and the slow erosion of Moldavian autonomy, followed by eventual absorption. Stephen saw where this road led because he had watched others walk it. Once the Ottomans tightened their grip, they did not loosen it. Local rulers became administrators. Armies became auxiliaries. Independence faded quietly, replaced by stability under someone else's authority. Stephen tried one last time to change the equation. Without bloodshed, he sent envoys westward. He appealed to shared faith, shared interest, shared fear. He warned that Moldavia was not the prize, but the gateway. If it fell, the frontier moved. If it held, everyone benefited. The responses were sympathetic and empty. Europe was tired. Resources were stretched. Each ruler believed someone else would take the risk first. When the final Ottoman ultimatum arrived, Stephen did not convene a council to debate morality. He understood the stakes clearly. This was no longer about preserving favorable terms or negotiating status. This was about whether Moldavia would exist as a political entity at all. Survival had become the only choice left. The Ottoman response was decisive. Sultan Mehmed II, already known as a conqueror, authorized a major campaign, not a raid, not a warning. An army estimated at around 80,000 men was assembled under Hatem Suleiman Pasha. It included seasoned infantry, elite janissaries, cavalry, artillery, and logistical support refined through decades of expansion. This was a machinery that had crushed fortified cities and open-field armies alike. It moved with confidence because confidence had been earned. Against this, Stephen could muster perhaps 20,000, and that number hid uncomfortable truths. Many were local levies, men pulled from farms and villages in the dead of winter. They lacked uniform equipment, lacked the illusion of invincibility, and lacked the luxury of believing defeat would be someone else's problem. But they possessed something less visible and more durable: familiarity. They knew the land. They knew the forests, the rivers, the way sound carried, or didn't, when fog settled in low valleys. Stephen made a decision that defined the entire campaign. He would not defend cities. He would not meet the Ottomans in a traditional set-piece battle where numbers and discipline favored the invader. He would fight on his own terms, even if those terms looked like retreat to outside observers. Villages were evacuated. Supplies were removed or destroyed. Roads were obstructed. The land itself was stripped of anything an army could comfortably rely on. This was not a strategy of desperation. It was a strategy of denial. Stephen chose Vaslui deliberately, a narrow valley hemmed in by forest marshes, cut by frozen streams, prone to thick winter fog that could linger long after sunrise. It was terrain that punished speed, disrupted coordination, and turned numerical superiority into confusion. An army trained to move as a system found its strengths diluted here. Orders echoed and returned distorted. Visibility collapsed. Units drifted apart without realizing it. For Stephen, Vaslui was not a gamble. It was an acceptance of limits. He knew he could not outfight the Ottomans in a fair contest, so he refused to offer one. He placed his forces carefully, concealed, divided, ready to strike not as a single wave, but as pressure applied from multiple directions. The goal was not annihilation. It was fracture, breaking cohesion, sowing doubt, turning advance into hesitation. As the Ottoman army entered the valley in January 1475, it did so believing history was on its side. Large armies rarely lost to smaller ones. Empires did not fall to principalities. Experience suggested this campaign would end like so many others: resistance, collapse, absorption. What the Ottomans underestimated was not Moldavian courage, but Moldavian clarity. Stephen was not trying to win glory. He was trying to survive long enough to change the narrative, to prove that inevitability was an assumption, not a law. For the men standing in the cold that morning, this was not about faith or empire or legacy. It was about whether their homes would still be theirs by spring, whether their ruler had chosen wisely, whether strategy could outweigh momentum. At Vaslui, Moldavia did not prepare to make history. It prepared to interrupt it. Stephen understood something that many leaders never do, even when the evidence is in front of them. When you cannot change the balance of power, you change the conditions under which power operates. He did not look at the Ottoman army and ask how to defeat it head-on. He asked a quieter, more dangerous question: how to make its strengths irrelevant. The preparation for Vaslui began long before the first Ottoman unit crossed the border. It began with discipline, not the kind that comes from fear alone, but the kind that comes from shared understanding. Stephen did not promise his men victory in the heroic sense. He promised coherence. Everyone would know their role. Everyone would know when to move and, more importantly, when not to. In a world where most medieval battles were decided by impulsive charges and personal glory, restraint became the most valuable weapon he had. The land itself was the first system Stephen put to work. Moldavia was not rich in stone fortresses or deep reserves of manpower, but it was rich in geography. Forests that swallowed sound, rivers that shifted from obstacle to highway depending on the season, marshlands that looked solid until a horse stepped into them. Winter transformed these features into something sharper. Snow erased familiar paths. Ice invited speed and punished it when it cracked. Stephen ordered villages evacuated along the Ottoman approach routes. Food was removed, burned, or hidden. Wells were fouled. Bridges weakened. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was calculation. An army of 80,000 men does not live off courage. It lives off grain, fodder, and predictability. Every mile march without resupply stretched Ottoman logistics thinner, forced longer foraging expeditions, and increased exposure to harassment. This was starvation as strategy, not siege. Small Moldavian units appeared briefly, struck supply parties, and vanished back into the forests. They avoided prolonged engagements. They refused to hold ground. To Ottoman commanders, this behavior was frustrating, but not alarming. Harassment was expected. What they failed to see was the cumulative effect. Every skirmish drained energy. Every delay consumed time. Every night spent in hostile territory, without clear information, eroded confidence. Stephen wanted the Ottomans tired before they ever saw his main force. More importantly, he wanted them impatient. Disappearing was not weakness. It was choreography. Moldavian forces retreated in visible ways, retreating just enough to suggest fear, never enough to suggest collapse. To a confident army, retreat invites pursuit, and pursuit in unfamiliar terrain is where discipline begins to fracture. Units stretch, coordination loosens. The system becomes a collection of parts rather than a unified whole. The Ottomans were trained for decisive engagements. Their doctrine prized momentum. Once an enemy appeared to yield, pressure was applied relentlessly. Stephen anticipated this instinct and built his plan around it. He was not trying to stop the Ottoman advance immediately. He was trying to guide it. By the time the Ottoman army reached the valley near Vaslui, it had already been conditioned to expect flight, conditioned to expect disorder, conditioned to believe resistance would collapse once contact was made. This belief was not arrogance. It was pattern recognition based on decades of success. Stephen intended to exploit that habit of thought. Vaslui itself was a final variable. The valley narrowed movement into predictable lanes. Forests flanked both sides, dense enough to conceal large numbers of troops. Frozen streams cut across the ground, their surfaces uneven and treacherous beneath layers of snow. In January, fog settled low and thick, muting sound and compressing distance. Visibility shrank to yards. Signals became unreliable. Control became localized. Stephen positioned his forces in depth rather than mass. Units were placed not to hold a line, but to apply pressure sequentially. Horns and drums were used not just to signal commands, but to create auditory illusions, suggesting movement where none existed, multiplying perceived numbers, disorienting those who relied on formation cues. The Moldavian army did not wait in silence. It waited in readiness. When the Ottomans advanced into the valley, they encountered exactly what Stephen wanted them to encounter: uncertainty. Attacks came from the fog, struck hard, and disappeared. Cavalry charges lost momentum on frozen ground. Infantry formations struggled to maintain alignment. Orders moved slowly, distorted by terrain and weather. Commanders acted on partial information, responding to threats that were already gone. This was not chaos. It was control pressure. Stephen never committed his full force at once. He resisted the temptation to exploit early success. Each engagement was calibrated to provoke reaction, not resolution. Ottoman units pushed forward to stabilize their position, only to find themselves exposed to flanking attacks. Support elements moved to reinforce, stretching the system further. What had been a single disciplined army began to function as isolated clusters, each fighting its own battle. For a smaller force, this was the only path to parity. The genius of Stephen's strategy lay not in any single tactic, but in the way the tactics reinforced one another. Starvation slowed the enemy. Harassment exhausted them. Disappearance shaped their expectations. Terrain punished their habits. Fog erased their advantages in coordination. Every element fed the next. This is where leadership became invisible. Stephen was not at the front seeking personal glory. He was managing timing, restraint, and commitment. He understood that the greatest threat at Vaslui was not Ottoman Street. Before dawn on January 10, 1475, the valley near Vaslui disappeared. Not figuratively, literally. A dense winter fog settled into the low ground and refused to move. It clung to frozen earth, crept between trees, swallowed ridgelines, and compressed the world into a narrow, breathless corridor. Visibility collapsed. Sound bent and echoed in unfamiliar ways. Distance became deceptive. For Stephen, this was not an obstacle. It was a final signal. The condition he had been waiting for had arrived. The Ottoman army entered the valley, believing it was pursuing a retreating enemy. Columns advanced steadily, boots crunching over frozen ground, wagons creaking, banners barely visible through the pale white haze. Tens of thousands of men moved forward with confidence shaped by habit. They had seen this before, smaller forces withdrawing, hoping to survive another day. The fog seemed inconvenient, but not threatening. Empires did not fear weather. They marched through it. What they did not see was that they were already surrounded. High above the valley floor, Moldavian troops waited in total stillness. They had been there for hours, positioned along ridges and tree lines, hidden behind earthworks buried under snow. No fires burned. No voices rose. Horses stood quiet. Reins held close. Archers kept their bows drawn but lowered. Infantry leaned into the cold, muscles tense, eyes fixed on shapes slowly emerging from the fog below. Stephen had ordered silence, and silence held. The first warning the Ottomans received was not visual. It was sound. A single horn echoed through the mist. Then another, then several more, calling from different directions, overlapping, bending through the fog until it was impossible to tell how many instruments were sounding or where they were coming from. The valley seemed to answer itself. The effect was immediate. Ottoman columns slowed. Officers shouted commands that scattered into the mist. Men shifted formation, raising shields, turning toward threats they could not see. And then the arrows came. They did not arrive in a single volley. They arrived in waves. Hundreds at first, then thousands, cutting through the fog with sudden violence. Shafts struck shields, armor, exposed faces. Men fell without ever seeing who had fired. The fog erased the origin of the attack, turning every direction into a potential threat. Return fire was erratic, wasted, aimed at shadows that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Before the Ottomans could stabilize, the cannon spoke. Small, mobile guns, dragged into position on sleds, fire from concealed ridges. Their thunder rolled through the valley, magnified by the fog and the slopes. The sound arrived before the impact, disorienting men already struggling to understand the battlefield. Explosions tore gaps through packed formations. Horses screamed. Orders dissolved into noise. This was not a single ambush. It was a sequence. As Ottoman units attempted to reform, Moldavian light cavalry emerged from the mist. They did not charge in straight lines. They struck at angles, cutting across flanks, firing arrows at close range, slashing with sabers, then retreating back into concealment before heavy troops could respond. They moved like fragments of a larger force, never staying long enough to be pinned down. To the Ottomans, it felt like fighting smoke. Every attempt to impose order triggered another disruption. Units advanced to engage attackers who had already withdrawn. Reserves moved forward only to encounter fresh strikes from unseen positions. The fog twisted sound, so commands arrived late or not at all. Drums beat in isolation. Standards disappeared. Cohesion, an empire's greatest strength, began to unravel. Stephen watched from above, unmoving. This was the most dangerous phase, not because the Ottomans were strongest, but because his own men could sense momentum shifting. The temptation to press too early was real. He resisted it. He waited until confusion became fatigue, until fatigue became frustration, until frustration tipped into panic. Only then did he give the signal. A deeper horn call rolled across the valley, distinct and unmistakable. From behind the fog, the Moldavian main force surged forward. Infantry poured down from the ridges, shields locked, weapons raised, striking an enemy already disoriented and compressed by terrain. This was not a scattered attack. It was a controlled release of pressure that had been building all morning. The effect was overwhelming. Ottoman soldiers, blinded by fog and hemmed in by uneven ground, found themselves struck from the front while cavalry hammered their flanks once more. Formations collapsed. Men stumbled over frozen mud slicked with blood. Horses slipped and fell. Shouts turned into screams. What had begun as confusion became full collapse. Some Ottoman units attempted to retreat across the frozen river that cut through the valley. Under days of marching, the ice had weakened. As men crowded onto it, arrows rained down. The ice cracked. Sections gave way. Soldiers plunged into freezing water weighed down by armor, dragged under by panic and exhaustion. Those who reached the far bank discovered no escape. Moldavian riders had already circled behind, sealing the exits. The valley became a trap in the purest sense. By midday, the fog began to lift. What it revealed was devastation. Ottoman standards lay in the snow. Bodies covered the frozen ground. Survivors fled into forests only to be hunted down by scouts who knew every path and hollow. The army that had marched confidently into Moldavia no longer existed as a coherent force. It had been broken, not by superior numbers, but by preparation, patience, and precision. Stephen entered the battlefield only when resistance had fully collapsed. He did not ride in triumph. He rode to confirm reality. Victory was not declared until it was secure. Orders were given to halt pursuit before discipline could erode. The danger, he knew, was not overconfidence. It was recklessness after success. By the time silence returned to the valley, the impossible had already happened. A small principality had shattered an imperial army, not through heroics, not through brute force, but through understanding how systems fail under pressure. At Vaslui, fog became a weapon, terrain became strategy, and restraint became decisive action. For those who witnessed it, the lesson was unforgettable. Size alone does not determine outcome. Control of conditions does. And in that frozen valley, for one decisive morning, control belonged to Moldavia. When the fog finally lifted over the valley of Vaslui, what remained was not the image of a glorious battlefield, but the quiet aftermath of a disaster. Broken formations lay frozen in place. Abandoned banners disappeared into the snow. The land itself seemed exhausted, as if it had absorbed the weight of what had just occurred. For the Ottoman Empire, this was a defeat few could explain. For Moldavia, it was survival earned at the edge of extinction. Stephen did not celebrate. He rode the field slowly, not to claim trophies, but to make certain the danger had truly passed. He understood something history often forgets. Winning a battle does not end a struggle. Empires recover. They return. Victory, if it is to matter, must be followed by discipline. So he reinforced roads, repaired defenses, and prepared his people for the certainty that this would not be the last test they faced. But Europe heard the echo. Courts that had ignored Moldavia now paid attention. Bells rang. Chroniclers wrote. The Pope called Stephen a defender of Christendom, not because he sought praise, but because his stand bought time for kingdoms that were not ready to face what had stopped. Vaslui became more than a battle. It became proof that inevitability is often an illusion. A small nation, isolated and outnumbered, refused to vanish quietly. It chose preparation over hope, structure over impulse, and patience over fear. And in doing so, it became a shield for an entire continent. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever faced pressure with limited resources, or understood that survival sometimes requires uncomfortable choices, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment sharing what lessons history has revealed in your own life, and stay with us, because the most important battles are rarely the ones fought with numbers alone.